Hello and welcome back to our last day of IndieX. Today we are fully on talk mode and our second talk of the day with Isaac Sanchez from Not a Game Studio. Unfortunately, Isaac couldn't be here with us, but he did record this talk and it will be available for questions, just written questions. So, with no further ado, let's go to the talk. Enjoy.
Hi everyone, welcome to the case against Fidelity. My name is Isaac Sanchez. Before we start, let me just present myself. This is my Twitter handle. If you like this essay, please follow me. I'm a game designer, technical game designer specifically. I've worked on a lot of games that are very different from one another, of different genres like 2D, 3D, mobile, VR. And I'm also the founder, of Not a Game Studio. We are a studio that creates experimental games that are genre-defying. We make weird games, and we've launched 3 games so far, and we're going to launch our 4th one, Who Killed Mr. White, the beginning of the next year. And now that I've presented myself, let's start with the case against Fidelity. So, 10 years ago, if you would look at this picture, you would probably think that it was a real photo. And some people might be fooled still today, because everything looks very, very realistic, right? Like the clouds look realistic, the lighting looks realistic. Like somehow, like it feels like a real photo, but it's a screenshot from Microsoft Flight Simulator. And it's not just that game that looks incredibly realistic. Actually, now it's very commonplace for most games, most AAA games, to offer some kind of very vivid, very convincing simulation of reality. This is to a point where you can render like scenes that would be thought of movies previously, of exclusively live action movies, or even pre-rendered CGI movies. But right now, like, you can render them on a like real-time rendering engine, right? This is a screenshot from Hellblade, and the face looks very, very convincing. So this talk is going to be about building a case against visual fidelity. And it's very obvious why we should root for visual fidelity. And I think like most people would not oppose visual fidelity at all. It looks awesome, right? The argument against it is a bit more tricky. And to go on and to talk a bit more about this, we have to first define what is visual fidelity. So our thoughts are not mixed together, right? So like one way of looking at visual fidelity is comparing what the user is experiencing versus what the user expects to experience, right? Like what the game should be, or the game, or like any other graphical rendering, but what the game in this case should be versus what the game is currently displaying. This would be something like this. Like there's entire videos discussing like what the machine is actually rendering versus what the players were sold, or like what the players expect. Like what's like on the high machine, like what kind of lighting, what kind of effects and particles you would see on a specific type of machine versus like what is actually being displayed. So that's one way of looking at it. There's an entirely different concept for visual fidelity. It's this one. It's the degree of exactness at which we are imitating reality. So that would be, for instance, comparing the Elder Scrolls 2 with the Elder Scrolls 5. You can see that characters, like at least this character, looks way more convincing that this character here, right? Like the ground feels more authentic, feels more convincing, than the ground here. Like everything in general feels more real, right? So we're gonna use visual fidelity in that sense. And one question would be, so that's just a fancy word for realism, right? Like why not call it realism? There's actually 2 points why I don't want to call it realism, and why I think you shouldn't as well. Realism is already a very charged word. It's a painting movement. It's also like in metaphysics, there's metaphysical realism. Like there's a lot of like already a lot of baggage with the word realism, and I think that that if we want to talk about this, we should define it as it is and talk about it as it is, and not necessarily bring all that baggage to the conversation. But even though that's the case, you could still argue that okay, but in painting realism is something, like in cinema it's a different thing. Why not talk about realism within the sphere of games, right? Because like the word realistic means exactly what we're trying to say with visual fidelity. And you're right, but fidelity is not necessarily realistic. And what I mean by that is this. So in God of War, the most recent game currently, you will see that everything is really well lit, is very, very convincing, has a really high visual fidelity. You can see that the skin looks real, the expressions look real, the actors are fully mocapped and you can feel them on the screen. Particles, like everything is really, really well done. And that can be realism sometimes. But when you're playing, that does not necessarily mean that everything is realistic. Like visual fidelity is not necessarily realistic. Here's an example. So you are experiencing the game's credits, for instance, and you want to look to the other side, right? And there's nothing wrong with, like, probably your eye is not going to catch that. But if you look at it really, really quick, you'll see that something is off, right? Like people, human beings, like even humanoid beings, because the character, I think, is not necessarily a human, but should move and feel like a human. Like is moving in this manner. Like that's not the proper way. Like that's not realistic, right? This animation is not realistic, even though it makes sense for the controls. Nobody moves like that, right? And that doesn't mean that the game is worse for it, actually, because it is still very realistic. It is still very convincing in most cases. Specifically in this one, it's not important, right? Like in this one, this is about player movement. So why compromise on player agency or movement with that kind of fidelity, right? Another example would be Naughty Dog, a studio that has a tradition of making very believable worlds, and has a tradition of making like really well crafted, well animated games, and if and to a point where like this is the remastered version of Uncharted 4. Like I can't really tell a difference without looking at every pixel. Like, but supposedly the normals and the textures are improved. So that's the kind of audience that Naughty Dog has, and that's the kind of product that Naughty Dog is building. But then if you play Uncharted, here let me slow down here. See, like Nathan Drake shot a rocket with a missile launcher into an old boat. A ship actually, and the whole thing exploded, and then it lands on the ship, and there's crates intact, like everything didn't move, like that's not realistic, right? And it shouldn't be. There's no reason for the entire ship to blow up and for everything to disappear. So why would that be the case? Like you're given a rocket launcher, you should use it, like it's part of the mechanics, it's supposed to be fun. But then again, we can't call this realism, right? This is not realistic. This is, even though like the explosions look very convincing, the way that they explode and the consequences of that explosion is not realistic. Also, on another note, like what happens to Nathan's rope? Like this is something that like most people would call the game very realistic, but the rope like magically goes into like his pocket. I don't know. Anyway, so that's not specific to just that game, like the whole Uncharted series. As like I'm comparing to the Uncharted series because everything is very very convincing, but even in the smaller details, you will see like weird stuff like this, right? Like the enemy somehow stops her and bam, like teleports almost to the back of the character and grabs the character. Like the more you look at it, the faker it looks. So to avoid spending too much time on Uncharted, let's look instead at Tomb Raider. So this is the latest installment in the Tomb Raider franchise, and you can see that there's a lot of care on what's being shown on the screen, right? Like there's amazing vistas, everything is very convincing, and it looks very naturalistic, the light is real, everything is real, and there's a lot of focus as well, just as with Uncharted, sorry, about like stuff like hair physics, like rendering of like the skin. But when you play, stuff like this happens, and let me slow down a bit so you can see. So again, everything looks very realistic, but like the jumping snaps, right? Like you can see here there's a snap, like the ballistics of Lara's body don't look real at all. And when you're playing, actually, it's not very jarring, but you can feel that it's not really real, right? Like you can feel that it's a bit distracting. As you go and play, you kind of ignore it, and you become used to ignoring it. But it's still very weird that she flies to the platform, to the handle, right? And you might say, okay, sure, but those are very small, like completely irrelevant, nitpicky details. And yes, you're absolutely right, they are. But so are these, right? Like, why would the scratches, like the resolution of the scratches and the simulation of the hair physics of Lara be more important than Lara flying, right? Like teleporting. Why would the realism of the eyes of this character, for instance, the resolution of every iris, be more important than the way a ship explodes, right? Like, it's clearly not about realism, it's about textures specifically, and it's about presenting those textures in a specific way. So it's not that we're worried about like realism per se, it's that we're worried about realism in specific scenarios. And I've given you very small and stupid and irrelevant examples, but that doesn't mean that there's only examples like this. Actually, the more you look at it, the more you start noticing that realism was never a priority. So to get back to Lara Croft, here's a section you can play where a jaguar mauls you, but actually like doesn't maul you to death. The more I look at this, the more goofy it looks. Like a jaguar is actually eating your back and clawing and mauling you and destroying your body, but nothing happens to it. And you get a flare gun, and then you shoot at the animal. But notice that there's not a single scratch on Lara, right? Are we looking for realism? Is this actually about realism, or is it about something else? Like, high fidelity doesn't mean that things look convincing all the time in all of the sectors of the rendering. So this is mainly why I don't like to use the word realism, and I think like we shouldn't use the word realism, because it's even though some things look realistic, not everything looks realistic, and not everything looks realistic all the time, right? Like, it's about achieving realism in a specific context, and in specific under specific rules. So that's what high fidelity is, or what the concept of fidelity is. let's go into what non-fidelity is, or like what the opposite of that concept would be. So if we go back to the concept of visual fidelity, if you remember, it's the objective degree of exactness of imitating real world experiences. I don't know like an opposite term or a contrary term for visual fidelity, but let's go with infidelity, right? That sounds like the opposite. And if you search for infidelity online, like it will give you the definition, the romantic definition of infidelity, which is when a romantic partner is unfaithful, right? Like that's sort of the baggage of that word. But I really like a specific part of that definition, which is about an unspoken assumption. Because even though that definition has nothing to do with video games, when you look at it from this specific lens, then it kind of makes sense. Because fidelity, like visual fidelity, is sort of an unspoken marriage, right? Because it means that you're married to reality and that you're married to imitating reality as much as possible. And you can see clearly that this is an unspoken marriage, because if you look at the history of video games, like let's go back to Lara Croft. Lara Croft used to look like this, doesn't really look real, doesn't seem as married to reality, and then with time Lara Croft looks like this, right? Like there's this constant mission, there's this constant bond, there's this constant goal of trying to be closer and closer and closer to like what real life feels like. And if you go back even to the first paintings that humanity worked on, right? Like if you look at it from a lens of progress, then you can see that these specific markings were trying to be real. They were trying to conjure the image of buffalo in this case, right? And from the beginning we wanted to replicate, to imitate art. From the beginning of the human experience, from the beginning of humanity. So when you look at video games, it's obvious that the path would be something like this, right? Where we get closer and closer and closer to reality, to a point where at some point we will be experiencing like a seamless simulation, like a perfect capture. Like, of course, I'm not saying this will happen or this can happen, but at least it feels like we're going more and more towards this seamless, really realistic simulation, like this authentic imitation of life, to a point where it feels exactly like being alive. And if that's at least fidelity, if that's the marriage of fidelity, then infidelity would be art that doesn't care about reaching that goal. It's art that tries to instead of imitating life, tries to imitate itself. Right? That would be something like Papers, Please, that of course is based in real life, but if you look at this screenshot, doesn't look real at all. And as there's another example where the water tastes like wine. Again, like it resonates with reality, but it's clearly not meant to be realistic or anything like that, right? Like, and I can give you other examples. This is Beckett. Again, it's readable, but like you don't feel like it's reality, or it tries to be reality. And I can give you a lot of other examples. We could be here all day and see like games that have actually, like for instance, Thumper, for instance, doesn't even look like it's trying to resemble anything. So let's recap. Visual fidelity is the idea of being married to reality or trying to imitate reality. It's like the entire industry seems to follow a rule of trying to be closer and closer to reality. This is not obligatory, of course, but like mainstream games, like where you will find infidelity is mostly in indie games. Mainstream games feel that they owe this to reality, that they have this sacred bond. And now I think we should look at what that sacred bond is, at what this marriage is actually about, and question its necessity. So YouTuber Austin McConnell made a video about escape rooms very recently, and in his video "Escape Rooms Are Broken, Let's Fix Them," he describes, among other things, the experience of going to an escape room that promised a setting of like steampunk setting, I think, and like a big train station. It was train themed, I think, if I remember correctly. And because he couldn't take any pictures inside, he decided to make this image on Photoshop to kind of describe the experience of what it was like to be there and to play. And it was essentially a white room with a bunch of locks and a bunch of luggage. And in his opinion, this was very underwhelming because it couldn't fit in the setting as a player. He couldn't feel immersed in the idea, the magic of what the train station was. He couldn't feel that he was in a train station at all, right? Like this didn't feel like a train station. And the video is, among other things, but mainly like a critique of low quality productions on escape rooms. And I totally understand his experience, because a few years ago, actually a lot of years ago, I was an avid player of LARP, which is an acronym for live action role playing games. And LARP can be very interesting when it works. It can be very immersive. When it's authentic, it like just really works. Sometimes it can be confusing, especially if you're new to it. But when you're playing with people that you've played for a long time, and when you understand the setting, it feels really real, right? And like there's a ton of settings. If you're not familiar with it, like you can play basically any like genre, any setting, as long as it's very well produced, as long as there's a high budget. But if it's low budget, then the feeling will actually be totally opposite. Like in low budget, you get this liminal space vibe where everything feels very goofy, and like everything feels very distracting as well. So you're trying to be this character, and you're trying to live in this world. Very similarly to what that YouTuber said about the escape room, you will be trying to get immersed in it, but then you look at someone's hand, and a prop for whatever is a yo-yo, and like you look at someone's t-shirt and it's a Star Wars t-shirt, and then like everything feels very cringe-worthy even, and then you look at that detail, and it's like there's duct tape holding everything together. It's nothing like this, right? It's something completely different, and yeah, like that's that's a situation that I actually remember of having a storyteller out of game. That's what the post-it is actually saying. Which means that there's a game master that you should ignore, that is right in front of you. But like, how can you ignore like it's a human being, and it's very distracting. Like that's what low budget LARP is, and that's why you might have sometimes bad experiences with LARP, because it's distracting, right? And now, like, let's get back to the escape rooms and imagine this, right? Like, imagine you have this group of players, and they're pointing at the map, and they think they've figured a solution for their escape room, but the solution is actually there's a code behind the map, we have to rip out the map from the wall, and then they cause damage on your room. Or imagine this, like someone said, okay, I think there's a key under this plant. Let's rip the plant out, and then there's actually no key. You just like the players just kill the plant. Or like you're in the room and someone says, I think there's a trapdoor under the piano, and then they try to lift the piano and they really get hurt because it's very, very heavy, and players don't know because they've never lifted the piano, right? So those types of scenarios, like just the last one, like the player tries to take off the mirror and it breaks. These types of scenarios are why a lot of escape rooms have caution tape. Like instead of having like a mirror, you will probably have a mirror and maybe like a small note saying, "Don't take off the mirror." Right? If those warnings didn't exist, like escape rooms simply do not work. Right? At least as a business model, or even for the user's safety, it's almost like it's mandatory. And that reminds me actually of how VR also works. So, like for instance, Oculus, but not just Oculus, like HTC, most headsets, like most hardware of VR, usually has some kind of boundary system, so you don't crash into the wall. Like it's very useful actually that you create that boundary, and as soon as you take an extra step and you get close to something, then yeah, like the boundary shows up. But again, it's very immersion shattering, right? Like it's very it doesn't feel real and feels distracting, and as a player you kind of get, okay, like maybe since this is necessary, I will start ignoring this. Of course, if this was always on, it would be harder to ignore, which is why it's not as distracting. But then like sometimes it appears, right? And because it's like the right balance of distracting, you manage to ignore it. So there's an implicit contract with VR, the same way that there's in escape rooms, of if there's tape everywhere, right? Like probably it gets distracting and you're pulled out of the experience. But if there's only small bits here and there, you can still bind in the fantasy. You can still enter this version of reality that is presented to you. And just to make a small detour on what we were saying back to video games, you will notice that it's kind of the same thing that happens on flat games, on like, let's say for instance Call of Duty. You have a lot of HUD all the time, and you try to ignore it as well. And you have to think, if the argument for fidelity is, well, like low fidelity is really distracting, like for instance I can clearly see that Lara Croft here is not a human, right? And that's distracting. That distracts me from the emotional resonance that the cutscene might have. That distracts me from like what the level designers might want me to feel. It's very distracting, of course. But then, like, if the reason for fidelity is to avoid distraction, then so are these elements, right? Like the same way that tape is. It's, of course, there's a balance. But we can't say in good faith that fidelity is about not distracting the player, or keeping the player as immersed as possible, because right now games are not very concerned about that, right? Like you keep seeing things on top of the screen distracting you. But right now, what I want to focus on is the ability of a player to be invested in a world that has elements like this, to be engaged with the world and to believe in the world despite this caution tape, right? Like this, despite seeing those distracting elements, despite seeing the HUD, despite all of that, you can still, as a player, if again those elements are balanced, they're not very frequent, you can still ignore them and still believe in that fiction enough. That would be very similar to you being in a LARP setting and seeing a full human being in front of you and trying your best to ignore that human exists, or like you playing a game where your main character is mauled by a wild animal and nothing happens to her, she doesn't even get dirty, right? So that concept, I think, like the word, the most popular word that's still very obscure, term, sorry, that describes that concept is simulation boundary. So what simulation boundary is, in practice, is that line where things stop behaving the way you would expect them to behave. And it's very similar to what we were just discussing. Because the player internalizes that a thing, even though it should work a certain way, it doesn't work. That would be, for instance, you see a lot of doors in a level and you see an open door and you go next to a door to open it, but it doesn't open, there's no prompt, right? And as a player, you accept that because you've never opened any doors in that specific game. But as a human being, you're like, maybe the door should open, right? Like, because that's what doors do, at least. Maybe it's locked, but at least you would feel that it's locked. It doesn't even have a prompt because you're not supposed to. That's what simulation boundary is. And the difference between what we were discussing and this is that it relates more to affordance, right? Like the act of opening a door, and not necessarily to the visuals or to the fidelity of the visuals, right? Like not necessarily to the presentation or just a presentation. Another concept that could be interesting to look at is suspension of disbelief. And it's probably closer to what we were discussing. So suspension of disbelief is exactly that. At some point you start ignoring specific distracting element. So you can buy more easily into the fiction of what you're experiencing. But it has nothing to do with agency. It has usually something to do with causality or with the internal logic of a story. Like it's more plot related more than mechanics related. Another interesting concept is cognitive dissonance, because like that's what suspension of disbelief and simulation boundary have in common, right? It's that idea that two different things that are actually contradictory should coexist. So in a way, like, I don't know if you are familiar with conspiracy theorists, but there's this study, for instance, that showed that people that believe that Princess Diana faked her death are more likely to believe that she was murdered. And that's a study, an actual study that you can just look up. So that would be a good example of a cognitive dissonance. And so if we think about that suspension of disbelief or that simulation boundary, which we shouldn't call simulation boundary because that's not exactly what the term is, we should probably call something else to the idea of looking at Lara Croft being mauled by a jaguar and actually feeling that everything is fine and realistic, right? Maybe we should call fidelity dissonance, right? Like we should probably invent a term, but let's propose that since we don't have one. So it's very obvious that fidelity is not realism, and it's very obvious that it's not here to solve distractiveness, right? Like it's not here to make you be more immersed, because if that was the case, like most gaming experiences wouldn't be about you trying to have that dissonance and trying to ignore like the HUD, the minimap, the warning signs, the storyteller, the jaguar that's killing Lara Croft. So let's get back to the Elder Scrolls for a bit, and you will see that the Elder Scrolls over time is becoming more and more, again, not to call it realistic, more authentic, right? Like it imitates life, even though again it's a fantasy game. It feels more lifelike because of its increased high fidelity. And there's a jump here, right? Like a big jump from here to here. It's only like a few. From here to here. It's only a few years, and that there's also a big jump from here to here. There's a big jump because like this is not even real full 3D, right? Like this is like a massive jump. But here, like it's a smaller jump, and then here, it's an even smaller jump, right? Like we are making progress, obviously, fidelity-wise, but like it feels like the curve is somewhat slowing. And what this feels like is an hyperbola, which is a special type of graph, a function. You can actually plot this yourself on Google, and you will see that, for instance, this formula goes higher and higher and higher the bigger the x is, but never reaches 5, right? And like it never reaches 5. But if you compare, like this is clearly lower than this. It's just increasing in smaller and smaller amounts. Doesn't this feel familiar? Doesn't this feel like what's happening with video games? Here's and of course I'm picking examples, but in general I think that with most examples that you will find, you will see that like this is a 5-year jump between Super Mario and Super Mario, like the same franchise, and this is a 5-year jump of a first-party game as well from Sony. Like this is from Nintendo, this is from Sony, 5-year gap as well, and yeah, of course this is a little bit better, right? Like it feels like an improvement, but it's not as big as an improvement as this, right? And so like it feels clearly that we're having diminishing returns on what fidelity can bring. But that doesn't mean that costs are getting lower. Actually, costs are getting higher and higher and higher. So this is the budget for GTA 4, and this is the budget for GTA 5. Like you can see on top of the screen, it's more than the double, right? And again, I'm picking examples, but this was actually studied. Up to this graph doesn't go further than 2015, but you can, like, if this is a trend, you can actually see that it's actually getting higher and higher. So this is on a log scale, which means that the growth is exponential. So to summarize the problem, we might have a cap of fidelity because it feels like it's converging to a ceiling. It's becoming more and more expensive to go to that ceiling, right? And budgets are becoming more and more massive. That also then leads to very aggressive monetization practices. Since you now require a massive budget to develop anything, then you need to pull in more money because at least in premium games, the base price like cannot go higher. Like it's already very expensive, and it already feels like a luxury item. But you have to have alternative ways of pulling in more money. That's the only way you can even make anything at this point, right? Like, and you see that on AAA games, but you also see that on AA games, and even indies are now starting to pull in those practices because actually, like, how can you even make a game at this point, right? You will see season passes, and that then translates to player malaise, to customer insatisfaction, and in general, there's you can feel like that players are not very happy about it, right? Like I'm gonna show you a review of Far Cry, which at the time of this recording was released a few weeks ago. And this review is from Vice. It's really over the top, and I don't endorse anything that's written, but you can feel that at least it's indicative of what the collective opinion right now is on these practices and on games in general, right? So one aspect of this is the aggressive monetization, but another aspect would be, for instance, the stability of products, right? Like this is also an article. If you have to ship games and reduce costs as you're developing them, then of course then quality will matter less and less, right? Like, because again, you only have a limited amount of money to develop. Any veteran dev will confirm that's happening, even though if you talk with any veteran dev, they will tell you that of course there's always been pressure to launch and to launch as fast as possible, and to there's always been massive entropy in the games industry and in development in general. No one's gonna deny that games are much more complicated to develop now, right? It's an incredibly complex system because fidelity is always increasing, right? The games are bigger and bigger and need more and more detail all the time, and that leads to much more complicated development cycles. Another way of looking at a potential problem of fidelity is looking at language itself. Games are a medium, they're an art form, and they communicate things. And higher fidelity also means compromising on what the player can experience. And let's get back to Papers, Please. So Papers, Please is a game that you could clearly say is not quote-unquote realistic, right? It's a game that could be accused of being unfaithful to that marriage with reality. Even though it feels real, it's clearly not a realistic view, right? On the top of the screen you have a panoramic view of a border control place. On the lower left you have a booth where you can see the people that try to cross the border, and on the lower right you have your actual booth with documents and whatnot. And this is a setup. The role of the player character in this game is to check the documentation, the visas of everyone that's trying to cross the border of this fictitious nation. You have to check every date of birth, every fact actually that's on the documents, and you have to cross-reference with what you're seeing and with the rules of the country. It's very tedious. So eventually someone will try to cross the border. You won't be able to interact with anything, and you will see someone throwing a bomb and then getting shot and killed. It's a very impactful moment, and it's a moment that will make you reflect and will make you feel what you've been doing with another lens. It's very impactful because your affordancy is removed. But now you're forced to look upwards, and you're forced to see what's going on at the border. So far you've seen people as mere documents. So far you've seen people as date of birth. So you've seen the nation as a rule set. But now for the first time you're actually seeing the human side of what you're doing. The question that we should ask ourselves is this: how else would you experience this as a player? How else? If this was presented in another way, how would you experience this moment? How would you be able? How could you see this moment from any other perspective? How could you experience this moment if this was a very high fidelity game? I mean, this could be a split screen game, right? But if it was a split screen game, then you couldn't move documents from one view to another, right? This could also be like a bird's eye perspective, a very detailed border control. But then again, you wouldn't be able to interact with anybody. And if this was a first-person game, again, like a normal, high fidelity way of presenting the game, then you wouldn't experience that tragedy that happened in the cutscene, right? Like you wouldn't be able to process what you're doing on a macro level. But the problem is, see, that this was never about realism, because a game about border control is actually much more realistic than any game, like the high fidelity examples that I showed. Like a lot of the games that I showed were fantasy or were action adventure. The other question that we have to ask ourselves is, could this game say anything about life, anything about reality, if it was just trying to imitate life? Would Papers, Please be more real if it was just an imitation of reality? And finally, our last point, water lilies. I'm showing you water lilies, and I've been showing you water lilies throughout this presentation because whenever I think of fidelity and the discussion around high fidelity or low fidelity, the importance of fidelity in the games industry, I'm always reminded of Impressionism. Claude Monet was one of the first Impressionists, if not the first, one of the most notable ones. Paul Cézanne was also an Impressionist. And Impressionism was a type of painting, a movement, that it's said to be inspired by photography. And a lot of other movements, consequently, were inspired by Impressionism. Like, for instance, Post-Impressionism, this is a Van Gogh. You have Expressionism. You have also Proto-Cubism, I think. I'm not sure. This is Cubism. You have a lot of movements. You have a lot of a new type of painting, a new way of looking at painting. When we can replicate reality very easily with just the press of a button, then you have, as a painter, you have to ask yourself, like, what's the point of painting even, right? Like, if it was just to capture reality in the most fidelity, right? The most realistic, the most the best imitation possible. If that was the purpose of painting, then what's even the point, right? Of painting anything. In the past, there was clearly a marriage. Painting became more and more high fidelity. The same way that video games are becoming more and more high fidelity. And there was this unspoken rule that this was the way to approach beauty. Then and up until that point, that this exact point where like there's no point to it, then this was the default. This was what was considered the grandmasters. And if you think about the human project as we discussed, like, it's obvious that there's clearly a point from the first drafts on a cave to the photography, right? Like if your goal is to replicate life, then okay, like, it's achieved. If you can add more colors, you can add less grain, you can better capture the light, but the device to capture reality is not the brush, it's that one. What else can you do besides reinterpreting life? And after that, like after this point, you see a lot of masters, a lot of masterpieces being reinterpreted by famous artists that try to break away from fidelity, right? This is Picasso. This is Picasso's version of Velázquez's Las Meninas. This is exactly the same painting, but reinterpreted by Picasso. You might not like it, you might think that actually this doesn't look like anything like that, but that's exactly the point. Because this is a bad photography, and this is a painting. This is what painting is now. This is what art means from that point onwards. Again, you see masters like Rembrandt being reinterpreted. Like, the idea is no longer to imitate life. The idea is to bring yourself into life, to create your own reality. And if we think about that ultimate point, the point that we were saying that was the point of video games. That point where you are like in a perfect simulation. The point where reality and the game is totally indistinguishable. The same way that a photography is just a capture of reality. I've been showing you water lilies from the beginning to the end of the presentation, but water lilies look like this. They don't look like anything Monet could make. This is reality. This is just reality. Monet is a multiverse of realities. Water lilies are just like this. This is what you can achieve with a photo. That would be my main point against Fidelity. My main point is, why would you want this? There's nothing special about what's being said about the object, about the lilies, because nothing is being said about the object. The lilies are just lilies. There's nothing else. There's no room for interpretation. There's no humanity. There's no subjectivity. Why would we waste time just with that? At least if we looked at real water lilies, we could have our own experience. But this is not an experience. This is just an imitation. It's a fabrication of reality. You can't even smell the lilies. You can't even touch the lilies. You can't live the lilies. I'm not saying that photography is not an art form, but again, photography is beautiful because of its subjectivity. If the goal was to just replicate the water lilies, what would be the point? I'm not trying to undersell the importance of Fidelity. The importance of Fidelity is very obvious. Right now, you can fly a plane in your couch. You can be sitting at your home and you can visit the entire world and it can feel very real. Nobody's saying that's not great. But is this the only way? Are we willing to sacrifice all of the different meanings we can achieve in games, all of the different experiences, all of the mechanics, the readings, the emotions, the value artistically, like commercially? Are we willing to sacrifice all of that for this? And that, for me, is the case against Fidelity. And if you enjoyed this essay, please follow me on Twitter. Thank you for listening, and I will be answering your questions in a few moments. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you, Isaac, for this enlightening talk. We'll have a few minutes if someone wants to bring up a question. Isaac will be answering in the chat box. So we do have a question. With the increasing improvements in AI, do you think will games ever turn into extra fidelity, meaning you would be able to play in a whole game painted by Picasso? So right next we'll have Ricardo will be talking with Agostino Simonetta from Thunderfall. Don't miss, it will be starting about 2 o'clock. So we'll be right back. Thank you once again, and we're out.